the morning of June 14th, 2019, a 51-year-old track inspector named Roy Delacourt walked a decommissioned rail line through the Nantahala district of the southern Appalachians and did not come back the way he came. The line had been out of service for years. His job that morning was simple. Walk the corridor, note the washouts, flag the rail that needed pulling before the salvage crews came through in the fall. He carried a clip camera on his vest, the kind the company issued after a man had fallen through a trestle 2 counties over and nobody could prove where. Roy had worn his for 11 months and never once thought about it. The footage from that camera is why any of this is known at all. Roy Delacourt was found 4 days later, a mile and a half off the corridor, sitting upright against a stone, with no memory of how he had gotten there and no clear account of the hours between. He never inspected track again. The recovered clip runs a little under 9 seconds. The corridor ran through a stretch of the Nantahala that had a reputation among the men who worked it, the kind of reputation that never makes it into any paperwork and gets passed instead in truck cabs and at the ends of shifts. There was a name for what the older hands said walked that section, and the name was Bigfoot. And they said it the way men say a thing they have half decided to laugh at, so they do not have to decide the other way. It was the line the older hands did not like to walk alone, and could not have told you why, and covered the not knowing with jokes about Sasquatch and left it there. Roy had heard the jokes for 30 years and had made a few himself. He was not a man who believed in anything he could not flag and measure. That is worth saying at the front, because everything that follows was told by a man who spent his whole life not believing in it, and who would have given a great deal to be able to go back to not believing. What follows is drawn from the corridor incident file and from the account Roy gave, in pieces, over the months after, to the one railway investigator who kept coming back to ask. This is his story, the way it was passed along. He had been walking since first light. That part he always started with, like it mattered, and maybe it did. The morning was clear and warm, and the birds were loud in the way they get in June. And he remembered thinking the corridor was in worse shape than the paperwork said. Ties rotted through. Ballast slid down the embankment in long grey fans where the rain had taken it. He walked the center of the 2 rails with his eyes down, counting the bad ones, and the forest came in close on both sides, the way it does on a line. Nobody runs anymore. He had worked track for 30 years, and this kind of line was the part of the job he had come to love and to distrust in equal measure. A running line has people on it, crews and signals, and the schedule that owns everybody's day. A deadline has none of that. A deadline is just a straight cut through country that has already started to take it back. And a man walking one is more alone than he is anywhere else in his life. And Roy knew that feeling and had made his peace with it years ago. What he noticed that morning, and mentioned to the investigator because it seemed important later, was that the peace was not there. He felt watched from the first mile, before anything at all had happened, before the birds, before the smell, and he had put it down to a poor night's sleep and a long drive to the trailhead, and had told himself to get on with it. He had left his truck at the gravel pull-off where the old maintenance road met the county blacktop, and he remembered that, as he shut the door and shouldered his bag, the woods on the far side of the corridor had been dead, quiet even then. And a jay had been screaming somewhere off to his left. One jay, going and going, the way they do when there is something on the ground they do not like. He had thought a cat, maybe, a bobcat moving through, and had not thought about it again until much later, when he was trying to lay the whole morning out in order for a man with a notebook and could not find the beginning of it. Because the truth was, it had started before he ever set foot on the line. The first thing that was wrong was the quiet. He put it at about a mile in. The birds had been steady all morning, and then they were not, all at once. The whole corridor gone, still like a room when a door shuts somewhere behind you. He stopped walking. He told the investigator he stopped without deciding to. A man who has worked outdoors his whole life knows the difference between a lull and a silence, and this was the second kind. And he stood in the middle of the dead line, with his notebook in his hand, and felt the hair come up on his arms, for no reason he could point at. Just before the birds went, he had passed the first thing he flagged that morning that had nothing to do with the rail. On a signal post at a grade crossing, one of the old cantilever posts left standing when the line went dead. Something had been jammed down over the top of it. A whole deer, a young doe, folded and pushed down onto the post so that it hung there, head down, a good 10 feet off the ground. He had stood under it and looked up at it for a while. A coyote does not do that. A bear does not do that. He had tried to work out the reach and the strength it would take to lift a deer that high and set it, not throw it, set it, and had not been able to make the arithmetic come out to any animal he knew, and he had written in his notebook, "Deer on the signal at the crossing," and nothing else, because there was nothing else that would fit in a notebook. He had walked on from it, and 100 yards past it, the birds stopped. He waited. Nothing moved. After a while, a single bird started up again, somewhere far off, and he felt foolish, and he told himself it was a hawk that had put them down, a shadow crossing the corridor, and he wrote a note about the rail and kept walking. That was the pattern of the whole morning, if you want to understand how it went. Something would be wrong. He would find the reason it was fine. Then he would walk a little further. The stacked stones came next. He found them at a place where an old maintenance path crossed the corridor. 3 flat creek stones, set one on top of another beside the rail. The biggest on the bottom and the smallest on top, balanced clean. He stood over them a while. A stack of stones is nothing. Hikers do it. Trail crews do it to mark a turn. But there had been no hikers on a deadline in years, and the salvage crews had not come through yet. And the stones were dry on top, and dark with damp underneath where they had sat, which meant they had been stacked and left, not knocked together by a flood. He nudged the top one off with his boot and felt strange doing it, like he had disturbed something, and he could not have said what. He wrote a line about the maintenance path and moved on. Then he found the second stack, a quarter mile on, and a third past that, each one the same, biggest to smallest, set beside the rail on the right-hand side, the forest side. He stopped counting them after the fourth. He told the investigator he stopped counting because counting them was making his chest tight. And a man does not want to admit that a pile of rocks made his chest tight, but that is what happened. Somebody had walked this line ahead of him, setting stones, and there was nobody who should have been on this line at all. The next thing was the smell. He came around a slow bend where the trees leaned in over the track and the smell was just there, waiting in the still air like something you walk into. He described it the same way every time. Wet dog and standing water, and something underneath that. He did not have a word for, something that sat at the back of the throat. He gagged on it and covered his mouth and looked around for the dead thing, because that is what a smell like that means. A deer down in the brush. A possum gone ripe in the heat. He did not find a dead thing. The smell was strongest right on the line, right where he stood, as if it had come up the corridor the same as he had. He wanted to say he turned back there. He did not. He had 2 miles left to flag, and a salvage schedule that did not care how the air smelled. And he told himself the wind had carried it from somewhere, and he pulled his collar up over his nose and went on. It was in that stretch that he saw the thing in the trees he could never account for. Off the right side of the corridor. Back maybe 40 feet, where an old blowdown had opened a gap in the canopy. 2 young trees had been bent over, and their tops woven together and pinned down under the weight of a third, making a low arch. A kind of doorway of living wood, a good deal taller than a man. He had seen storm damage his whole life, and this was not storm damage. Storms break and throw. This was bent, and held, and worked. The green saplings twisted, where they would have snapped if you were rough with them. And something about the patience it would take to do that. To bend a living tree slow enough that it bows instead of breaking. Sat very badly with him. He did not go closer to it. He stood on the line and looked at it, and had the strong and stupid feeling that it was a thing he was not supposed to have seen. And he walked on and did not look back at it. And he was aware the whole time of not looking back at it, which is its own kind of looking. The knocking started while he was still in the smell. It came from the forest on the right, back in the trees where he could not see. One hard crack of wood on wood, flat and deliberate, the sound a man makes splitting kindling with the back of an axe. He stopped. He waited. A minute passed, and it came again, once, from a little further up the line, keeping pace with the direction he was walking. He knew the sound. Every man who has spent time in these woods has heard a limb come down, or a dead tree let go. This was not that. A falling limb falls once and is done. This was struck and answered from somewhere across the corridor by a second crack, deeper, and then the 2 of them went quiet together, as if they had said what they needed to say. He told himself it was 2 limbs. He knew it was not 2 limbs. He walked faster. For a while after that, he had the sense of being kept company. He could not have proved it, and he knew how it sounded. And he told the investigator anyway, because it was the truest thing about that middle stretch of the walk. Off in the trees to his right, back in the green where the light did not reach the ground, something moved when he moved and stopped when he stopped. Not close, he never saw it, not so much as a shape, but the brush would settle over there a half second after he came to a halt, the way a room goes quiet a beat behind you when you stop talking. And once, when he stood dead still for a full minute to test it, he heard, plainly, the sound of a great weight shifting from one foot to the other and going still, waiting him out. Patient in a way that no deer and no bear has ever been patient with a man. He started talking to himself out loud around then. He was not ashamed of it. A man alone will do that. But he noticed that he had started doing it to fill the silence on his right. To put a human sound into the corridor so that he did not have to hear what was and was not in the trees. And when he noticed that was what he was doing, he made himself stop, and the quiet came back down, and the thing in the trees moved again when he did. The prints came next. He almost missed them. They were pressed into a soft grey fan of washed-out ballast, where a culvert had let go, and he only looked down because he was picking his footing across the slide. There were 3 of them, then a 4th, further on, sunk deep into the wet grit. He crouched over the nearest one with his hand out, not touching, just measuring against his own spread fingers the way a man does. It was longer than his boot, by half again. 5 toes, splayed, the big one set off from the others, and a heel that had pressed down hard enough to push a little wall of grit up behind it. He was still telling himself bear. He said that to the investigator more than once, almost angry about it, that he had knelt over a thing no bear on earth could have left, and kept the word bear in his mouth, because the word bear let him stand back up and keep walking. A bear print has claws. This had no claws. He knew that, kneeling there. He stood up anyway. What he could not put back into the bear story, though he tried, was the stride. He had knelt over the first one and then walked to the second, and it was too far, much too far. He measured it against his own steps out of a kind of stubbornness, walking heel to toe between the prints. And it came out at better than 5 feet from one to the next, an easy walking stride, not a leap, not a run, just the ordinary walking pace of a thing whose legs were half again as long as his. He stood between 2 of the prints with his arms out like a man measuring a room and could not make his own body span the gap between them. And he said that was the moment, more than the smell or the knocking or the deer on the signal post, when the bottom went out of the morning. Because a print can be faked, and a smell can be a dead deer, and a knock can be a limb. But a man cannot argue with the length of his own legs. And his own legs told him plainly that whatever had walked ahead of him up this line was built on a scale that had no name in anything he had ever flagged or measured in 30 years of work. He followed them without meaning to. That was the thing he could never explain to himself. The prints ran on up the center of the corridor in the direction he was already going, one after another in a long even stride, further apart than a man could step, and he walked in them because they were going his way. He kept his eyes down on them. He counted them the way he had been counting the bad ties. Partway along he found where one of them had come down on the rail itself. The steel was old and scaled with rust, and pressed into the rust. Clear as a stamp was the front half of a foot, the toes and the ball of it, in mud that had been carried up onto the rail from the wet ballast. He stopped over it. A print in soft ground is one thing. A print on the top of a rail meant the thing had stepped up onto the steel and down off it, the way a man crosses on a log, and had done it since the last rain, which had been the night before. It was ahead of him, not hours ahead. He understood that. Standing there, the way you understand a thing in the body before the mind will say it. Whatever had walked this line had walked it this morning, and it had walked it slow, and he had been gaining on it the whole time without knowing. He should have turned then. He knew the whole geometry of it now. The stones and the smell and the knocking and the prints, all pointing the same way up the corridor, all fresh, all his own direction. But a man who has told himself bear for 2 miles does not stop telling himself bear 100 yards from the end. And he kept his eyes down on the prints and kept walking, and because his eyes were down, he did not see the thing on the track until he was close. He looked up because the light changed. That is how he put it. The corridor ahead had been bright with morning, and then a shape stood in it and took the brightness out. And he looked up into the middle distance of the dead line, and there it was, standing on the ballast between the rails, facing him. He never once, in all the months of telling it, called it anything grander than it. But the men in the truck cabs had a name for it. And what stood on the track that morning was the thing they meant when they said Bigfoot. And Roy knew it the instant he saw it. The way you know a word you have known your whole life and never once had to use. It was tall. That was the first thing. Before he understood any other thing about it, that it stood a head and shoulders above where a tall man's head would be, that it filled the space between the trees. He was not a small man, and he had spent his life around big machines and big weather, and had a good working sense of the size of things. And he said the size was the part no photograph would ever carry, that a still of it would only ever look like a man in a suit, because a still could not hold how much of the corridor it took up. How it changed the scale of the trees behind it. How the two rails that had looked a standard gauge apart his whole career suddenly looked narrow with it standing between them. It was covered in hair, dark, rust and brown near the shoulders, and going almost black down the flanks. Matted and hanging in long strands, where the morning damp had weighted it. It stood on two legs, and it did not stand like a bear reared up, unsteady, meaning to drop. It stood like it had always stood on two legs. Its arms hung long and heavy at its sides, and the hands at the ends of them, he said, were the second thing that was wrong after the face. Because they were hands, with fingers that hung the way a tired man's hands hang, and he did not want to talk about the hands either. He could not move. He wanted to be clear about that part to the investigator later. It was not that he chose to stand still. His legs had simply stopped being his. The face was the worst of it. He never gave much of the face. He would start to and then stop, and the investigator learned not to push. It was not an animal face, was as far as he would go most days. There was no snout to it, no muzzle pushed out the way a bear or a dog has. It was flat and broad, and there was a heaviness over the eyes, like a shelf of bone, and the eyes underneath were dark and wet, and they were looking at him, not through him, at him. He said that was the thing that broke something loose in his chest, that it was not looking at him the way an animal looks, sweeping and dumb, but the way a person looks who has decided something about you. They stood like that, he did not know for how long. Time did a thing out there that he could never put right afterward, stretched and folded, so that the standing felt like a long while and no while at all. The corridor was dead silent again, the way it had gone silent that first time a mile back, and he understood now what had put the birds down, and had understood it then without letting himself, and the smell was all around him thick as water. It made a sound, low, in the chest, more felt than heard, a sound he had no name for, and did not try to give one. Not a growl, he was firm on that. A growl is a threat, and this was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was the sound of a thing that did not need to threaten him. That was simply deciding, the way you would look at a dog that had wandered into your yard. Then it moved its head, a small motion, side to side, low, reading him. And he saw, when it turned, that one ear had a notch torn out of the top of it. An old wound, gone to hard scar, and he did not know why that was the detail that finished him. The ordinariness of it. That the thing had been hurt once and had healed, that it had a history, that it was alive in the specific way a hurt and healed thing is alive. It took a step toward him. He heard the ballast go under its foot. He heard that clearly, the crunch and slide of a great weight coming down, and it was that sound, not the sight, that put his legs back under him. He said he did not remember turning. He remembered the trees going by sideways. He remembered the corridor was behind him, and then it was not. That at some point he was off the line and into the brush, and going downhill through laurel, so thick he had to swim it, branches tearing his vest. And behind him, not close and not far, keeping pace, he could hear the thing coming through the brush, after him, slow, unhurried, breaking greenwood like it was dry grass. That was what he came back to most in the retelling, and what he could least stand. It did not run. He was running the way a man runs once or twice in his life, past thought, past breath, throwing himself downhill through cover that should have stopped him cold, and the thing behind him was walking. He could hear it in the rhythm of the wood breaking, an even unhurried stride, no faster than a man strolls a sidewalk. And it was keeping up with him. It was keeping up with him at a walk. He understood, somewhere in the animal back of his mind, while the front of it was only screaming that it could have had him whenever it wanted. That it was not chasing him at all, that it was seeing him off the way you walk astray to the edge of your property. And that the reason he was still alive to be walked off was a decision it had made back on the track when it looked at him and did not close the distance. He ran until the ground fell away under him at the creek bank, and he went down it in a slide of mud and stones and came up in cold water to his waist. And he stood in the creek with his chest heaving and listened, and the walking had stopped. The wood was not breaking anymore. He stood in the water a long time. He did not know how long, waiting for it to start again, and it did not. And that was the last thing he could hold on to in any order. After the creek, there is nothing he could give the investigator that the investigator was willing to write down as fact. The clip ends before any of that. The camera on his vest caught the shape on the track and the first step it took, and then the frame goes to sky and green and the ground, the tumbling nothing of a man running, and there is no more of it that anyone can use. Roy Delacourt walked out of those woods 4 days later, a mile and a half from where the clip was recorded. On the far side of a ridge he had no business crossing, with no memory of the days between, and no injuries that a doctor could name beyond dehydration and the cuts from the laurel. He could not say where he had been. He could not say what he had eaten or where he had slept or why. When they found him, he was sitting so calmly against that stone, as if he were waiting for a train on a line that no train had run in years. There were pieces that came back to him later, in sleep mostly, that he gave the investigator with great reluctance, and never let be written down as fact. He would wake with the sense of having been carried, not roughly, a swaying that he associated with being very small. He had a picture in him of lying on his back in the dark and looking up at trees moving past overhead. High up, the canopy sliding by the way it does from a car window, and of not being afraid, which frightened him worse in the waking than any of it. That in the memory he had not been afraid. He had a picture of eyes at a distance, more than one set, low to the ground, watching a fire that was not his. He would not say the fire was theirs. He would not say anything was theirs. He said only that the 4 days were not empty in him, that something was in them, and that he could not get at it, and that he had stopped wanting to. The dehydration was real, and the doctors treated it. But a man does not go 4 days in June in those hills and come out with nothing but a dry mouth and some scratches. And the investigator noted, quietly, in a part of the file that was his own and not the company's, that Roy Delacourt came out of the woods heavier than he went in, by the notch on his own belt, which is not a thing 4 lost days should do to a man. There was one more piece, and it was the piece the investigator sat on longest before he wrote it down. In the months after, Roy started going back. Not to the corridor, which was gone by then, but to the country around where it had run, parking at pull-offs and walking a little way in and standing. His wife told the investigator about it because she was frightened by it. That her husband, who had come out of those woods, a changed and quieted man, who flinched at the smell of a wet dog and would not go outside at dusk, kept driving an hour to the edge of that forest and standing at the tree line for an afternoon and coming home calm. She had asked him what he was doing out there. He had told her he did not know. He had told her once that he thought he was being cold and did not know how to explain it, and would she please not ask him again. And the investigator wrote that when he put this to Roy directly, Roy did not deny it, and said only that whatever had walked him off that line had not finished with him, that it had let him go but had not let him go, and that some part of him had been left back in the 4 days he could not remember and was still there, and wanted the rest of him to come back for it. The investigator underlined none of that. He simply wrote it and left it, because there was nothing to be done with it, and closed his part of the file a line below. The salvage cruise went in that fall as scheduled. The corridor was pulled and sold for scrap, and the right-of-way went back to the forest. In the incident file there is a note that the company man walked the section where the clip was recorded before the cruise came through, looking for the prints, and found the ballast at the culvert had been raked flat, whether by rain or by hand. The note does not say. There is a note that the smell Roy described was recorded by 2 of the salvage men that fall, in the same stretch, and dismissed as a dead animal that was never located. There is more in the file than the company meant to keep in it. The investigator who kept coming back to Roy was not a company investigator by the end. He had started as one, working an injury claim, a man out 4 days and unable to work. And somewhere in the months of sitting across from Roy, he had become something else. A man who could not let a thing go, and the last third of the file is his own. In it he wrote that he had gone looking for the earlier cases, the ones the district had lost on that corridor, and that he had found the district was reluctant to produce them. He wrote that, when he did get at them, 2 files from the 1980s and 1 from before, that they read the same. A man alone on the line. A stretch of hours or days unaccounted for. A recovery, when there was a recovery, on the wrong side of a ridge. Calm, unhurt, unable to say. He wrote that the smell was in one of them, described almost word for word as Roy had described it, by a man who had been dead 20 years and could not have coached the account. He wrote that in the oldest of the files, from before that, someone had written the word Bigfoot in the margin in pencil and someone else had erased most of it, and that you could still read the ghost of it under the erasing if you held the page to the light. He wrote one more thing and then the file stops. He wrote that he had asked the district why a rail corridor with a history like that had been kept in service as long as it had, and then marked for salvage so quietly, and that the answer he got was that the corridor had not made money in decades, and the land was worth more cleared, which was true, and which he wrote down, and under which he wrote that it was also true that pulling the rail closed a right of way to the public for good, and put a forest back, where a straight walkable line into the deep country had been, and that he did not know which of those 2 reasons had done it, and that he had stopped, being sure the 2 reasons were different. And there is a line at the bottom of the file, in that same hand, that says only that the corridor had a history, and that Roy Delacourt was not the first man the district had lost track of on it, and that the earlier files had been closed and boxed and were not attached. That is where the file ends. What walked up the center of a dead rail line to meet a man who was only there to count bad ties, and why it looked at him the way it did, and what happened in the 4 days he cannot account for, is not in the file, because no one who could answer it has ever been willing to. Real or fake, you decide. On the night of October 9th, 2021, in a closed section of National Forest, in the same stretch of the southern Appalachians, a wildlife camera on a survey grid recorded a large upright figure walking across its frame in the dark. What the footage appears to show, what the people who have seen it since have called it, is a Bigfoot. Diane Estrada never used that word in her notes. She was a scientist, and the word was not one a scientist could write down. But it is the word for the thing on her card, and it is the word for the thing the track inspector met on the rail line 2 years before her. And it is worth saying plainly at the front, because she spent 6 weeks refusing to say it, and it did not save her. The camera belonged to a 43-year-old agency field biologist named Diane Estrada, who had set the grid herself 6 weeks earlier as part of a routine deer density study. Diane Estrada pulled that card on the morning of October 12th. She logged it, she copied it, and within a month the section was closed to all entry. The survey was reassigned, and Diane Estrada stopped answering her phone. She has not been located since. She was not a person given to any of this. That matters, the same way it mattered with the track inspector, and for the same reason. She had a master's degree in wildlife biology and 11 years with the agency, and a reputation, among the people who worked with her, for being the last one in a room to accept an explanation she could not measure. She counted things. She had chosen a career of counting things precisely because the count did not lie and did not need her to believe it. The notes she left are the notes of a person watching her own instrument return a reading she cannot accept and cannot make go away, and the horror in them is not the horror of a believer. It is the horror of a careful person whose care has stopped protecting her. What is known of the weeks between is known because she kept a second set of field notes apart from the agency log, and because those notes and her copy of the card were left with a relative before she went back into the section the last time. What follows is drawn from those notes, in her words where they can be given, and from the agency correspondence that was later pieced together around them. This is her account, the way it was passed along. She set the grid in late August. 31 cameras, she wrote, staggered across a section of ridge and hollow the agency had flagged for a density count before a timber assessment. It was ordinary work. She had done a dozen grids like it. The cameras were motion-triggered, dated, timed, and she pulled the cards on a 2-week rotation and logged what crossed them. Deer, mostly. Bear. A bobcat that made her whole month. The kind of quiet, patient work she had chosen the job for. The first wrong thing was small enough that she wrote it down as a fault. One camera on the grid, the one she numbered 19, kept logging triggers with nothing in the frame. A trigger means something moved, something warm, close enough and large enough to trip the sensor, but the frames were empty. Forest, dark, nothing. She wrote in her notes that camera 19 had a fault and needed swapping, and she went on with the rotation. Because a faulty sensor is the most ordinary thing in the world, and she had a grid to run. It was going through the older paperwork on the section that gave her the second wrong thing. Before the agency opens a section for a study, someone pulls the file, and in the file for this one was a case number. A man had gone missing in the section the spring, before the grid went in. A forager, she wrote. Out after ramps and morels, the way people are in these hills, every April, who had parked at a gated logging road and walked in and never walked out. The search had run 2 weeks and found nothing. Not a pack, not a boot, not a scrap. The case was open and cold, and the section had been quietly kept off the recreation maps ever since, which was part of why it was clean ground for a survey. She wrote that she thought about the forager more than the work called for. She told herself it was because she was alone out there, that a person alone in the woods will pick at a thing like that. She kept running the grid. The third wrong thing she almost did not write down at all, because it made her sound like the kind of biologist she did not want to be. The deer stopped using the section. Not all at once, but over the first 3 weeks, the density she was there to measure fell toward nothing. A section that should have been thick with them in the fall went quiet on card after card. Deer do not empty out of good ground for no reason. Something moves into a range and the prey animals read it and go, and every part of her training told her that. And she wrote in her notes that the count was collapsing and that she did not want to think about what a count collapses around. Then she crossed that last line out, she noted, because it was not scientific, and then she wrote it back in underneath, because it was true. She found the hair on camera 26's mounting strap in late September. Coarse, dark, longer than her hand, snagged where nothing that size should have brushed, at a height above her own head. She bagged it the way procedure said, labeled it, wrote the collection in her log, and sent it up with the rotation. It is not in any agency record that was later found. She noted in her private book that she had sent it. That is the only place it exists. Then she pulled the card from camera 22 on the October rotation and found the pass. She described it plainly, which is somehow worse. A large figure, upright, walking left to right across the frame in the dark, lit gray by the camera's own infrared. It crossed most of the frame in an even stride. And then, near the right edge, before it left the frame, it stopped, and it turned its head, and it looked back at the camera, directly at it. For most of a second, the face was square to the lens, pale in the flat light. And then it turned away and walked on out of frame, and the clip ended on empty forest. She wrote down bear, she wrote down hoaxer. She wrote down a hunter in the section that had no business being in a closed section. She wrote all 3 down in a row in her notes, and then she wrote a 4th line under them, which was that a bear does not turn and look at a camera. It should not know is there, and she did not have a 5th line. The 5th line, the one every person who has watched that clip since has reached for, the one that begins with the word Bigfoot, she would not write. And the not writing of it is all over the pages that follow. In the care she took never to name a thing, she was plainly by then trying to survive. She started reading the whole grid differently after that. She went back through the rotation cards she had already logged and dismissed, and the figure was in them, not every night. But across the grid, over weeks, the same tall, upright shape, always moving, always at the far edge of the infrared, where the gray went to black. And it kept to a route. She could see it once she was looking for it. It moved through the grid along the same line, night after night, and the line it took ran through every camera on the grid except one. It never once crossed camera 19, the camera that kept logging empty triggers. The one blind spot on the grid, and it walked the edge of that blind spot like it had paced the whole thing out. That was the thing she could not make small. An animal does not learn the shape of a camera grid. She wrote that sentence and underlined it, and did not write anything after it that night. She drew the grid out by hand the next day, all 31 cameras, and traced the route on it in pencil from the logged nights. And what she got was not the wandering line of an animal working a range for food. It was a circuit. It came in from the north end along the ridge, up through the hollow, ran the far edge of the grid, and came back. And it did this on the nights it came at all. The same loop, tightening. That was the word she used, tightening. Each pass the loop was a little smaller, a little closer into the center of the grid. And the center of the grid, when she measured it, was the gated logging road, where the forager had parked and walked in and not come out. She sat with that a long time. She wrote that she checked her own arithmetic twice because she did not want it to be right. And she noticed the thing about the timing that she liked least of all. It came when she pulled cards. Not on the rotation exactly, but the heaviest nights. The closest passes fell in the 2 or 3 days before she was due to walk in and swap the cards. As if it knew the rhythm of her visits, the way it knew the blind spot of camera 19. As if the grid were not her instrument at all, but a thing the two of them were reading together. And she was the one who had come late to understanding what it was for. She did one more thing with the cards before she reported anything, the thing a person who counts does, which is that she counted. She went back through every logged night since the grid went in, and marked each one the figure appeared, and she laid the marks out on a calendar. And she sat looking at the calendar for a long time. There was more than one. That was what the calendar showed her, that no single card could. On 4 separate nights, the figure crossed 2 cameras at the same timestamp that were too far apart on the grid for one thing to have walked between them. She checked the distances and she checked the times, and there was no error in it. On those nights, there were 2 of them on the grid at once, moving the route from different ends. And on one of those nights, when she plotted where the 2 lines would have met, they met at camera 19. The blind spot, the one place the grid could not see. She wrote that she did not know how many of them there were. She wrote that she had built an instrument to count deer, and it had, without her ever intending it, started counting something else. And that the something else was more than one. And that they used the blind spot to be together, where nothing watched. And she stopped writing for the night there, and the next entry is 2 days later. There was an incident at the gate that she wrote down before she reported anything. Because it happened before she had decided the grid was more than a grid, and it is worse for that, told plain and early, with no frame around it. She had come out at dusk after a rotation, later than she liked, and reached her truck at the gated logging road. And while she was loading the card case into the back seat, she heard, from up the road behind the gate, in the section, a sound she took at first for a screech owl, and then knew was not. It rose and held and fell, too long for an owl, too deep, with a wet edge to it at the top, like a voice that had been meant for a throat shaped differently than a voice comes from. It came once. She wrote that she stood with her hand on the truck door and did not turn around, that she got in and locked the doors, which she noted was a foolish thing to do against whatever could make that sound, and that as she pulled out, she looked in the mirror, and the gate was as she had left it, and the road behind it was empty and dark. And that she drove the 40 minutes to the highway faster than the road allowed, and could not have said what she was running from. Only that the sound had not been a warning to her, it had been a call. It had been aimed past her, at something further off in the dark, and she had happened to be standing in the middle of it. There was a swap visit between the 22 card and the day she reported, that she wrote up in full, because it was the last time she went into the grid alone, before she understood what she was walking into. And reading it back, she seemed to want a record of a version of herself that still thought she was safe. She went in at midday to swap cards on the north cameras. It was bright and ordinary, and she was almost easy about it. And at the base of camera 26, the one that had snagged the hair, she found the cards. Not the camera's card, her cards. 2 SD cards from cameras she had swapped on the previous rotation and logged as collected and had, she was certain, carried out in her vest and filed. They were set on the flat top of a rock at the base of the post, side by side, squared to each other. The way she found the stones squared, the way a person sets down 2 things they want you to notice they have set down. She stood over them a long time. She wrote that the ground told her nothing, that there was no reason on earth for 2 cards she had filed at her office, 40 minutes away, to be sitting squared on a rock in the middle of a closed section. and that she picked them up and they were her cards, her handwriting on the labels, and that she did not sleep that night. And that in the morning she told herself she must have dropped them on the earlier visit and that something had simply moved them. And she knew, as she wrote it down, that a thing which moves 2 dropped cards does not stack them square and set them where you will come back and find them. A thing that does that is not moving them, it is answering you. It had been reading the grid the whole time, and now it wanted her to know that it knew the grid was hers. She reported it up after that, and after the 22 card, not the gate. That is where the shape of the thing changes, in the notes and in the correspondence both. She sent the 22 card and a summary up her chain the way procedure said to, expecting nothing. Expecting a note back telling her to swap the faulty 19 and finish her count. What came back instead was a request for the cards. All of them. The originals. And the request did not come from her chain. It came with a unit designation she did not recognize and had never seen attached to a density survey. A designation she copied into her private notes by hand, because, she wrote, she did not trust it to still be in the system later. The correspondence that was later assembled shows the section closed within 11 days of that request. The stated reason was corrupted survey data. Diane's grid, her 6 weeks of clean logged cards, was recorded in the agency system as a data loss and written off. Her notes from those days are shorter and harder. She wrote that a man came to collect the cards in person and had her sign a document she was not given a copy of. She wrote the unit designation again. She wrote that when she asked what this had to do with the deer count, the man told her the survey had been reassigned, and that she would be reassigned with it, and that the forager case was closed, which she noted was strange, because she had not mentioned the forager to him. The man was not an agency man, she was sure of that, and wrote down why. He did not know the section names, he did not know the rotation, he asked for the cards by the grid number she had assigned, which meant he had already read her private numbering off a report she had only sent up her own chain, and he corrected her once when she misspoke a number, which meant he had the whole grid memorized. A deer survey he had supposedly never seen before that week. He wore no agency identification and gave a name she did not believe, and he knew, without being told, that she had pulled the historical file on the section, because when she mentioned the case number he said, before she finished, that the case number was no longer active and moved on the way a man moves on from a thing he has already handled. She wrote that she asked him one direct question. She asked whether other sections had been closed, like this one. She wrote that he looked at her for a moment and then said that she should focus on her reassignment, which was not a no, and that both of them knew it was not a no, and that he left with all 31 original cards in a hard case, and her signature on a page she would never see again. She should have stopped there. She wrote something close to that herself, but she had kept a copy of the card and she had kept her notes. And she had the whole logged grid in her own hand, and she was a person who counted things for a living and could not leave a count unfinished. What she pieced together in the days after is the part of the notes that reaches past that one section of forest, and it is the part she was most careful with and least willing to state plainly. From a line in the collection document she was not supposed to read, and from a designation she recognized turning up on paperwork for a section 3 states, north, she came to understand that her grid was not the only one, that the same kind of survey had been run and closed the same way in other sections, in other states, each one carrying its own quiet case number, its own person who had walked in and not walked out. She did not write that it was a program. She was careful not to write that word. She wrote that the closures had a pattern, and that the pattern was old, and that no one who ran it seemed to think it was unusual, which was the thing that frightened her most, that whatever this was, it was routine. She had access, for a few more days before her reassignment cut it off, to the kinds of interagency records a field biologist can pull without anyone thinking twice. Land use closures, timber deferrals, the dry municipal paper that surrounds a piece of managed forest. And she used those days to trace the designation, the way she would have traced the species through a range, by its sign, because she could not go at it directly. She found it on a closure in the Monongahela. She found it on 2 in the southern Appalachians beyond her own. She found it, older, on paper from the 70s, the same 3 or 4 letters and a number, always attached to a section that had been surveyed and then shut. always within a season or two of someone going missing in it. Always with the missing person case going cold and quiet at the same time the section did. She wrote that the oldest one she could find was from before she was born, and that it read exactly like the newest, and that a thing which does not change over 50 years is not a mistake and is not a coincidence, and that she did not have another word for it that she was willing to write. What she would not write, what she circled around for half a page and then left as a question, was the direction of it. She wrote that she had assumed at first that the surveys went in to study the land and stumbled onto the thing that lived in it. But the paper did not read that way. The paper read as though the surveys went in already knowing where to look, as though someone had a map of these sections before the cameras ever went up. And she wrote that a density grid is a very good way to learn the movements of something large and careful and nocturnal without ever admitting, that is what you are doing. And then she wrote that she wished she had not thought of that. And then she wrote nothing for a day. One of the sections she found in that paperwork was a decommissioned rail corridor in the Nantahala, closed after an incident 2 years before her grid went in. She noted the physical description attached to it. Over 7 feet. Upright. Not the face of an animal. A torn notch in the left ear, which she underlined because it was too specific to be the kind of detail a frightened man invents. And because it meant the thing in the corridor and the thing on her grid were not two of a kind, but very possibly the same one, ranging a territory that took in a rail line and a survey section and the 50 miles of ridge between them. She wrote that down and drew a line between the two entries and wrote a single word beside it, which was pattern and nothing else. There is a passage near the end of the usable notes before the last night where she wrote about the track inspector directly, and it is the closest the two accounts ever come to touching. She had found his name in the corridor file attached to the designation, and she had done what a careful person does, which was to try to reach him. She wrote that she found he was alive, that he had left the railway, that he lived not far from the forest the corridor had run through. She wrote that she called him. She did not get much. She wrote that he was guarded and tired and did not want to talk about the line, but that when she described her grid and the route that tightened and the one camera the thing left alone, he had gone quiet for a while and then had said one thing that she wrote down word for word and underlined twice. He had said that it had not chased him either, that it had walked him out, that whatever it did not do in a hurry and it did not do by accident, and that if it was leaving a camera alone, it was leaving that camera alone for a reason, and she should not be the one to go and find out what the reason was. She wrote under that, he sounded like a man warning me off a thing he knew I was going to do anyway. And then she wrote that he had said one more thing before he got off the phone, quietly, almost to himself, that he still went back to the tree line some afternoons and stood there, and that he could not tell her why. And that she should be careful. The thing did not leave a part of her out there the way it had left a part of him, because a part of him had not come back, and he had made his peace with never getting it, and he hoped she would not have to. She went back to the grid one more time. The notes do not fully explain why. The closest she comes is a line saying she wanted to pull camera 19 herself, the blind spot, the one the figure had walked around for 6 weeks. Before the collection was complete and the ground was gone to her for good. She wanted to know what the empty triggers had been. Underneath that, in the last words she wrote before the final night's entries, she wrote that the inspector had told her not to go and that she was going, and that she thought she had understood, on the phone, the thing in his voice that she had taken for fear and that she now thought had been something closer to longing. And that she did not like that, she understood it. The last entries are time-stamped over a single night. She wrote that she reached the grid after dark, which she knew was wrong, which she wrote was wrong, even as she did it. She had timed the drive to arrive with light, and the drive had run long, and she had sat in her truck at the gate for a while, deciding. And she wrote that she went in because she believed the collection would be finished within days, and this was her last chance at camera 19. And because, she admitted on the page, some part of her wanted to be out there once more before the ground was closed to her. Wanted to stand in the middle of the thing she had spent 6 weeks learning and see if she could feel it the way the deer had felt it. The way that had emptied them out of the section. She wrote that she got her wish. She wrote that the woods were doing the quiet thing when she came in off the gate. The full quiet, no insects, no owls. The quiet she now knew to read. She wrote that she made herself keep to the plan and walked in toward camera 19 with her light low, and that she was perhaps halfway when the first camera tripped somewhere behind and to her north, and she saw the faint infrared flash light the underside of the canopy for an instant and then a second one further along, and she stopped walking and understood what she was watching. The grid was firing, the route was running. She could stand in the center of the map she had drawn and watch the thing come down. It in real time, camera by camera. The flushes stepping through the trees in sequence, and the sequence was not random, and it was not going away from her. She wrote that she should have run for the gate, and that she did not, because the gate was back along the route, back the way the flushes were coming. And every animal instinct she had left told her not to move toward the thing in the dark. So she went the only other way, on toward 19, on toward the blind spot, and she wrote, in a hand that had gone bad and hard to read on the recovered page, that she understood only when she got there why it had left 19 alone for 6 weeks. It had not been avoiding the camera. It had been keeping the one place on the grid where nothing would ever see what it did, and she had walked herself into the center of it, in the dark. And behind her, the last 2 cameras before her position fired within a minute of each other. She turned on her light and put it up the route. She wrote that at the edge of it, where the beam gave out, something stood in the dark and was already square to her, already looking, the way it had looked at the lens and had been looking, she wrote, for longer than the light had been on. She wrote that it did not shield its eyes from the beam and did not move away from it, that it stood in the full of her light at the edge of the clearing and let her see it, see her, over 7 feet of it, the flat, pale face, the heavy shelf of bone above eyes that took the light and gave it back, and that it was not afraid. And that in all her years of putting cameras on wild animals, she had never once photographed a thing that was not, at some level, afraid of her. And that the absence of that fear was the last piece of information she recorded before she understood, fully and too late, what the surveys had actually been counting, and who had been the count all along. Her notes end midline there. There is no more of them. Diane Estrada was never found. The section remains closed. Her final card, the one recovered later from the copy she left behind, shows the grid firing in sequence exactly as she wrote it, camera after camera, down the route, and then her own last camera catches the beam of a light swinging up into the trees, and one gray shape at the far edge of it, and then the frame goes dark and stays dark. The people who walked the grid afterward were not the agency. The agency by then had no grid on the books to walk. It was the relative she had left the notes and the card with who pushed, and a county investigator who took it up on his own time, when the county's own interest in the case cooled faster than a 2-week disappearance of a state employee should have made it cool. What that investigator found, and put in a report that has been quoted since more than it has been seen, was that there were no tracks at any of the camera posts, in ground still soft from a week of rain, where the weight of a person swapping a card leaves prints for days, and where the weight of the thing on the cards should have left something a great deal deeper. He found her truck at the gate, locked, her keys not in it, and never recovered. He found camera 19 exactly where she had set it, still standing. Still logging empty triggers into a card no one had swapped, still faulted, still blind, and he noted that when he pulled that card and read it back, the empty triggers on camera 19 went on at their regular intervals. Through the whole of the night she disappeared, and for 3 nights after, something large and warm passing close in front of a lens that showed only forest, and that they stopped on the 4th night, and the camera had logged nothing at all since. He wrote one line that the quoting always leaves out, which is that when he requested the original 31 cards, the ones collected by the man Diane described, he was told there was no record of any survey ever having been authorized in that section, and no record of the section having been surveyed, and no record, when he pushed, of the section having been closed, though he was standing at its locked gate when they told him so. The researcher David Paulides has spent years cataloging the disappearances of people from wild land in patterns that the agencies who manage that land will not connect out loud. People who walk into a section of forest under clear conditions, experienced, prepared, and are simply not there afterward. Packs left behind. Search dogs that run a trail hard and confident to a point on the ground, and then stop and circle, and will not go on, as if the trail did not so much end as leave. Cases that are worked for a week or two and then go cold and quiet and are closed and boxed. Each one on its own, none of them set beside the one before it. So that a pattern 50 years deep can sit in the files of a dozen agencies and never once be laid out on a single table where a person could look at the whole of it at once. That was the thing Diane understood in her last clear days, the thing that frightened her worse than the grid. Not that the Bigfoot in the forest was real, that the not looking was deliberate, that somewhere the whole of it had already been laid on a table and looked at and understood, and the closures and the corrupted data notes and the men who collect deer counts in person were not a failure to see the pattern, but the shape the seeing took. The people who go looking for Sasquatch tend to picture, at the end of the search, a body, a proof, a thing held up to the light at last. Diane's notes point somewhere colder. They point at the possibility that the proof was gathered a long time ago by people whose job is not to show it to you, and that the surveys go into the forest, not to find out whether the thing is there, but to keep the count of where it is. And that once in a while, the count includes the person doing the counting. Diane Estrada's grid, and the forager before her who went in for ramps and did not come out. And the rail corridor, 2 years and 1 ridge away, where another man met a thing over 7 feet tall with a torn notch in its left ear. And the sections 3 states north, with the same few letters and 1 number on the same dry paperwork. And the oldest closures from before she was born that read exactly like the newest, sit in that pattern like points on a line that no one who could draw it has ever been willing to draw. She drew as much of it as she could reach, in pencil, in a private notebook, and left it with someone she trusted, and went back into the section one last time to pull the one blind camera, and became another point on her own line. What walked her grid for 6 weeks, and paced the one blind spot in it, and what the empty triggers on camera 19 were, and what unit sends a man to collect a deer count in person and close a forest around it, and where Diane Estrada is, are not in the notes, because the notes end where they end, and no one has taken up the count since. Real or fake, you decide.